Most nights in a Victorian home did not begin with fear. They began with tiredness. Bodies lay down because they had no strength left to remain upright. The room was dark, not by choice, but by necessity. The candle was blown out. The world did not disappear all at once. It withdrew slowly, leaving behind the weight of the bed, the closeness of the walls, and the sense that the night itself had entered the room. In that darkness, people became aware of every small sensation, every shift of fabric, every movement that could not be clearly seen. In these homes, sleep was rarely deep at first. The body rested, but the mind stayed alert, listening. Old houses moved in the night. Wood contracted, floors settled, rats passed through walls. Insects crawled across, skin warmed by shared blankets. Air currents pressed cloth against legs and arms. These touches were ordinary, expected, and yet never fully explained. Lying still, people often asked themselves quiet questions they never spoke aloud. Was that my own movement, or something else adjusting itself in the dark? Tonight, we will move slowly into those rooms, not to frighten, but to understand. To sit beside ordinary people as they lay awake, feeling the night press closer, noticing sensations they could not name or prevent. This is not a story of ghosts or imagination, but a proximity of bodies, of homes that were never fully empty. As you settle in, allow the pace to slow. Let curiosity stay awake for a moment longer before the calm returns. Night inside a Victorian home began the moment light became too expensive to waste. Candles were measured, trimmed, and extinguished early, not when people felt ready for sleep, but when the household decided darkness must be accepted. As flame vanished, rooms did not become empty, they became close. Walls felt nearer, ceilings pressed lower. The bed was no longer furniture, but territory. A narrow place where the body waited, listening to the house resume its quiet movements without witnesses. Beds were rarely isolated objects. They were placed near walls, beneath windows, beside shared trunks or washstands. In many homes, several people slept in the same room, sometimes in the same bed. Even when alone, a sleeper was surrounded by signs of others. Folded clothing, boots drying near the hearth, breath marks lingering in the cold air. The bed did not belong entirely to one body. It existed inside a space already filled with use, memory, and residue. As the body settled, sensations sharpened. Without light, the smallest contact became noticeable. Sheets, brushed ankles, wool blankets, scratched necks, straw mattresses shifted inside beneath weight. Dust loosened from beams above and settled softly onto skin. These were not surprises. They were familiar enough to ignore, yet persistent enough to register. The night reminded sleepers that stillness did not equal absence, and comfort was always provisional. Victorian homes were live in ways modern buildings are not, but expanded and contracted with temperature. Floorboards flexed, nails shifted. Somewhere in the walls, small bodies moved with purpose. Rats, mice, and insects followed paths they had memorized long before human sleep began. Their movement was rarely seen, but often felt. A vibration through the bed frame, a faint brush against fabric, a pause that lasted just long enough to be noticed. Insects were constant companions. Fleas hid in seams and straw. Lice clung to hair and collars. Bed bugs emerged when warmth settled into the mattress. These creatures did not announce themselves dramatically. They arrived as brief touches, faint pressure, an itch that could not be scratched without fully waking. Most people learned to remain still, allowing discomfort to pass rather than inviting awareness. Touch became something to endure quietly, not investigate. Lying awake, many asked themselves questions they would never answer. Was that movement caused by the body adjusting, or something else responding to heat and breath? Did the blanket shift because of air, or because it had always shifted that way? The mind searched for reassurance and familiarity. If the sensation was common, it was safe, and so people closed their eyes again, letting the night continue its slow contact, trusting routine to protect them until morning returned. Clothing worn to bed rarely separated the body from the world. Nightshirts were thin, often reused without frequent washing, absorbing the day's labor in the room's lingering damp. Skin met fabric, already familiar with sweat, smoke, and dust. As people lay still, warmth gathered slowly, drawing life closer. Small creatures were attracted, not by malice, but by heat. Their presence was sensed as weightless movement, a brief crossing that left no mark yet refused to be ignored. Blankets, too, were unreliable barriers. Heavy and uneven, they slid with the body's smallest shift. A fold pressed unexpectedly against a knee. A corner brushed the back of a hand. In the dark, the body reacted before thought intervened. Muscles tightened, breath paused, then released. Most touches were nothing at all, but the body could not know that immediately. Night demanded patience, teaching people to remain still until certainty returned. Air itself moved with intention. Drafts slipped through cracks in windows and beneath doors, lifting hair, cooling exposed skin, causing fabric to flutter lightly against legs and shoulders. These currents felt deliberate in darkness, as if the house were breathing. People learned the patterns of their rooms, recognizing which walls leaked cold and which corners gathered warmth. Familiarity softened unease, but never removed it completely. Sleep came in fragments. Between these fragments, awareness returned quietly. A hand brushed the mattress edge, confirming space. Fingers pressed into straw, wood, or rope beneath. These gestures were small acts of reassurance, performed without thought. Touch, in this way, became a language between the body and its surroundings. It confirmed location, orientation, and safety without requiring light or sound. Over time, the night taught acceptance. Not every sensation required meaning. Not every touch demanded response. People learned to let the house exist around them, moving, settling, pressing close. Sleep arrived when resistance faded. The body, accustomed to constant contact, finally rested, not because the world became still, but because it proved itself familiar enough to endure. Night was not empty time in these homes. It was active, crowded, and layered with quiet labor that did not stop simply because eyes closed. Even after bodies lay still, the house continued its routines. Fires cooled slowly, releasing smells of ash and damp stone. Water settled inside pipes and buckets. Its walls absorbed the heat of the day and released it unevenly. The sleeper did not leave this system. They lay inside it, pressed gently by its slow movement. The bed itself was rarely clean by modern standards, but it was familiar. Straw shifted and compacted over weeks, molding itself to repeated shapes. Dust collected in seams and corners where fingers never reached. Each night added another layer of presence. Sweat dried. Skin cells fell away. Oil from hair transferred to fabric. These were not signs of neglect in their time. They were evidence of use, of survival, of a bed doing its only job. Touch during the night often came from the body itself. Limbs brushed against one another in the dark, unfamiliar for a moment before recognition returned. A knee met a calf, an elbow pressed into ribs. In shared beds, this confusion extended outward. Another person's warmth shifted. Breath changed rhythm. Can rested where it had no intention of remaining. These contacts were not intimate gestures. Were corrections, adjustments made without waking fully. In many homes, sleep was interrupted, not by fear, but by necessity. A child stirred. A cough echoed too long. Someone rose quietly to tend a fire or relieve themselves in a chamber pot. Movement passed through the room gently, felt more than seen. The bed responded to weight changes nearby, transferring motion through floor and frame. Even those who did not wake sensed this disturbance as a brief tightening of muscles before rest returned. Animals shared these nights. Cats climbed onto beds without invitation, seeking warmth. Dogs slept beneath frames, shifting when sleepers moved. Farmhouses hosted larger presences. Chickens kept indoors, livestock close enough that their sounds filtered through walls. These lives brushed against human rest constantly, a flick of fur against an ankle, a breath from beneath the bed. These touches required no interpretation. They were expected, even comforting. Not all contact was welcome, but it was tolerated. Dampness crept through sheets in colder seasons, pressing chill against skin. Mold thrived in corners, releasing spores into night air, accumulated where windows remained closed. People learned to sleep within these conditions rather than resist them. Discomfort became background. The body adjusted its expectations downward, conserving energy by accepting what could not be changed. Between sleep and waking, thoughts surfaced slowly. The mind, freed from daylight tasks, became sensitive to the body's smallest signals. An itch suggested infestation. A pressure suggested weight that did not belong. Most of these impressions dissolved when examined, but examination itself required effort. Many chose instead to remain still, allowing uncertainty to pass without resolution. In this way, night trained patience more than fear. Touch at night was rarely named. People did not speak in the morning of sensations that lacked explanation. To do so invited concern without solution. Instead, experience was folded into routine. Another night survived. Another morning reached. The house continued to hold its occupants closely, reminding them through constant contact that privacy, like cleanliness, was limited by circumstance rather than choice. As night deepened, the boundary between the body and the house softened further. Heat pooled unevenly beneath blankets, creating pockets of warmth that shifted slowly as sleepers adjusted. This movement invited contact. Fabric clung briefly to skin, then released. Hair brushed against cheeks. Moisture from breath dampened collars and pillows. These sensations were subtle, repetitive, and unavoidable, reinforcing the sense that sleep occurred within a shared environment rather than a sealed personal space. The mattress itself responded constantly. Straw compressed and rebounded with each breath and movement. Feathers migrated toward edges, leaving hollows that pulled the body inward. Ropes beneath sagged unevenly, creating pressure points that pressed into hips and shoulders. These pressures were felt most clearly in stillness. The body learned to recognize them as signals, guiding small adjustments made without waking fully, accommodating discomfort. Walls contributed their own forms of contact, radiated inward during winter nights, settling against exposed skin like a second layer of fabric. In summer, dampness clung to surfaces, releasing a faint moisture that softened wood and stone. Leaning too close to these boundaries meant feeling the house directly through chill or condensation. Sleepers often turned inward instinctively, curling away from walls, seeking warmth in the center of the bed. Sound played a role in shaping touch. A creak beneath the floor suggested movement below. Faint scrape within the wall hinted at unseen paths. These noises directed attention toward the body's surface, heightening awareness of any simultaneous sensation. When a sound coincided with a touch, however minor, the mind paused. Was there connection or coincidence? Most nights offered no answer, only the return of quiet and the gradual easing of tension. In shared rooms, this uncertainty was multiplied. Another sleeper's restlessness translated through floorboards and bed frames. A cough vibrated through air and fabric. A hand shifted beneath blankets, brushing against skin not its own. These moments rarely escalated. Familiarity returned quickly, and with it acceptance. Proximity was normal. Was part of coexistence, stripped of meaning beyond its immediate presence. Morning eventually erased the night's questions. Light revealed the sources of sensation: rumpled sheets, displaced blankets, disturbed straw. What had felt intentional in darkness appeared ordinary by day. People rose without comment, folding the night's touches into memory without naming them. The house reset itself. Beds were aired, rooms ventilated, surfaces wiped where possible. Yet traces remained, waiting for darkness to return and bring them back into awareness once more. Cleanliness in these homes was not defined by absence of dirt, but by familiarity with it. People knew the texture of their own skin after days without washing. They recognized the smell of themselves and others, not as something shocking, but as a stable presence. At night, when warmth gathered beneath blankets, these smells intensified. Sweat released slowly from pores. Old soap traces mixed with smoke and fabric. The body sensed itself more clearly in darkness, not through sight, but through accumulation. Water was not easily accessible, and this shaped how touch was understood. Washing required planning, fuel, time, and effort. As a result, skin carried layers of the day into bed. Dust from streets, grease from tools, residue from food preparation all remained. When limbs brushed against one another at night, they met surfaces already marked by labor. This contact was not unpleasant, so much as expected, reinforcing the idea that the body was something used continuously, not refreshed daily. Hair carried its own weight into sleep. Oils built up along the scalp, transferring onto pillows and collars. Lice and fleas hid there easily, feeding unnoticed until irritation demanded attention. Scratching in the dark was cautious and restrained, guided by touch alone. Too much movement invited wakefulness. Too little allowed discomfort to persist. Most people found a balance, responding just enough to remain asleep, accepting irritation as part of rest. Clothing absorbed and redistributed these sensations. Night garments were rarely separate from day, where in poorer homes, shirts and shifts worn beneath work clothes were often slept in as well. They retained warmth and odor, pressing familiar textures against the skin. As bodies shifted, fabric tightened or loosened, creating brief moments of pressure that felt almost like contact from another presence. The body learned to interpret these signals without alarm. Over time, the line between the self and surroundings blurred. Skin did not feel separate from sheets. Breath did not feel separate from room air. Touch became constant but unremarkable. In this environment, sleep depended not on comfort, but on tolerance. Rest arrived when the body accepted contact as unavoidable, allowing sensation to continue without demanding explanation or relief. Animals moved freely through many Victorian homes, especially at night. Cats slipped beneath beds, drawn by warmth and quiet. Mice followed the edges of rooms, their movements soft but noticeable to anyone half awake. Sometimes a tail brushed a foot, or whiskers grazed skin exposed beyond blankets. These moments were brief, often dismissed before fear could form. People learned to recognize the difference between danger and familiarity through touch alone. The house itself responded as temperatures dropped. Wood contracted, releasing small sounds that felt closer than they were. A loose board might press upward slightly as weight shifted above it. Mattresses filled with straw or horsehair settled unevenly, poking or resisting the body in slow, persistent ways. These pressures felt alive, not because they moved quickly, but because they changed over time, responding subtly to heat and posture. Hands resting outside blankets encountered cooler air, sometimes brushing damp walls or the rough edge of furniture. In crowded rooms, another sleeper's elbow or knee might drift close without intention. Such contact rarely startled anyone awake. Privacy was limited, and bodies learned to share space instinctively. Touch was negotiated silently through gradual adjustments rather than conscious reaction. Fear, when it appeared, was quiet and short-lived. The mind was too tired to imagine threats fully. Sensations were assessed quickly, then absorbed into the background of sleep. If something touched the body and did not persist, it was forgotten. If it remained, it became part of the night's texture. The body adapted, letting sensation exist without interpretation, allowing rest to continue in imperfect conditions. Night inside a Victorian home was never completely still, and touch often came from the building itself. Walls that held moisture during the day released it slowly after sunset, leaving surfaces faintly damp and cool. Someone lying close to the wall might feel that chill seep through thin fabric, a steady pressure rather than a sudden shock. It felt like the house leaning inward, reminding sleepers that they were resting inside something old, heavy, and always shifting. Bedding added its own quiet sensations. Blankets were thick but uneven, worn thinner in places where generations had slept before. As bodies warmed them, fibers expanded and settled, slowly tightening or loosening around limbs. A sleeper might wake briefly to the feeling of fabric pressing against the throat or wrapping around an ankle, not tightly enough to alarm, but firmly enough to be noticed. These touches were familiar, expected, and rarely resisted. Air itself could feel like contact. Cold drafts slipped through cracks in doors and windows, brushing across skin with a deliberate slowness. A face uncovered by blankets might feel that movement and mistake it for a moment as a hand passing by. The sensation lingered just long enough to be acknowledged before the mind relaxed again. In homes without steady heat, air was never neutral. It moved, pressed, and withdrew like a living thing. People learned to sleep with these sensations because there was no alternative. Touch at night was part of the environment, not an interruption. The body adjusted its expectations, lowering its guard, allowing pressure and movement to exist without demanding explanation. Over time, these gentle intrusions blended into the rhythm of rest, becoming as normal as breathing, as unremarkable as darkness itself. In rooms shared with others, touch became a conversation without words. Limbs shifted under blankets, brushing accidentally against neighbors, sometimes warm from the day's labor, sometimes cold from restless sleep. Hands pressed briefly against a shoulder, a knee nudged into an arm. These movements were seldom acknowledged aloud, yet they communicated boundaries, proximity, and comfort. People adapted quickly, learning when to yield space and when to remain still. A silent negotiation repeated each night. Small animals contributed to these nightly contacts, slinked over blankets, seeking warmth, kneading fabric with paws, brushing tails against ankles or calves. Dogs slept beneath beds, nudging feet or bumping hips in search of a secure spot. Even mice, moving along the edges of rooms, could be felt, their tiny feet or whiskers passing across skin through the thin walls of clothing or bedding. These intrusions were minor, expected, and eventually accepted as part of ordinary nights. Bodies responded instinctively to all touch. The nervous system distinguished between heat, pressure, and movement without the mind needing to intervene. A brush of hair across a cheek, a draft lifting a sleeve, the subtle rise of the mattress under weight. Each registered as sensation, but did not necessarily provoke reaction. Sleep relied on the ability to allow these signals to pass without turning them into worry. This skill was learned gradually over countless nights. The weight of blankets, the uneven surfaces of straw-stuffed mattresses, and the pull of gravity on thin sheets all contributed to the sense of constant contact. Every night was a lesson in patience and tolerance. The body discovered its limits and capacities, adjusting positions subtly to avoid discomfort while still surrendering to rest. By the time dawn approached, these touches, once startling or intrusive, had become so familiar that they no longer interrupted the flow of sleep. Evening routines shaped the way bodies and minds prepared for contact in the night. By the time lamps flickered low, people had already engaged in small, repetitive tasks that carried residue into sleep. Hands that had kneaded bread, scrubbed dishes, or folded clothing retained a faint stickiness or roughness, brushing against fabric and skin with every movement. The body carried these textures as silently as it carried memories, unremarked until darkness deepened and awareness dulled, leaving touch as the primary sense of presence. In shared rooms, the rhythm of others' preparation influenced sensation. A neighbor adjusting blankets, stretching aching limbs, or shifting position to find warmth created vibrations through floorboards and bed frames. These minor disturbances were never abrupt enough to wake someone fully, yet they added layers to the experience of night. Each touch, each movement, registered as a physical echo of life continuing beyond oneself. A quiet reminder that sleep was always a negotiation rather than a solitary retreat. Children added unpredictable shifts to the night. Small bodies wriggled under blankets, seeking warmth or adjusting restlessly. Fingers brushed exposed skin, knees nudged against shins, and hair fell across foreheads. Parents or guardians remained aware, half asleep, accommodating these intrusions instinctively. The touch of a child did not provoke irritation so much as gentle alertness, a measured response calibrated over years. Evenings were structured around these patterns, teaching bodies to tolerate proximity and movement without losing the rhythm of rest. The materials of the home amplified every sensation. Straw mattresses shifted unevenly beneath weight, producing subtle springs or hollows that altered how limbs settled. Wooden floors and furniture absorbed motion but transmitted vibrations unpredictably. Cold walls, heavy drapes, and worn blankets pressed against skin, contributing to the constant presence of touch. Even the air carried sensation. Drafts brushed against uncovered shoulders or ankles. Moisture clung faintly to fabric, and the temperature of a room dictated how closely bodies huddled together. Some touches were deliberate, even if unnoticed consciously. A neighbor repositioning a pillow might guide an arm into a more comfortable place. Shared blankets caused brief contact that, in the dark, could feel deliberate or accidental. People became attuned to these distinctions, learning to sense intention without the need for sight. Sleepers distinguished between routine contact and something unusual, a skill developed through repeated, quiet observation of bodies in proximity. The night was not static. Bodies adjusted constantly, responding to pressure points, fabric shifting, or nearby motion. Each minor alteration in touch required a subtle recalibration of position. Yet these adjustments were automatic, almost unconscious. The nervous system parsed the sensations as information rather than distraction. Touch became a language of the night, communicating comfort, limitation, and the boundaries of shared space without words. Animals contributed to touch in ways that were often overlooked. Cats and dogs sought warmth beneath or beside beds, their soft bodies pressing against limbs or feet. A paw against a calf or a tail brushing a hand was accepted without thought, part of the nocturnal texture of the home. Insects, too, left traces, the occasional tickle of a flea or the slide of a beetle across the bed frame reminded sleepers that the environment extended beyond humans. That touch was not always predictable, and that control was limited. Evenings were rituals that conditioned bodies for this intimacy with surroundings. Bathing was rare. Hands and faces might be wiped down, but full immersion in water happened infrequently. Skin carried the day's labor, dust, sweat, oil, remnants of food. These residues remained on the body, transferring subtly to linens, chairs, and neighboring bodies. The tactile memory of each day persisted into night, shaping the feeling of being held by the house itself, by warmth, texture, and the presence of others. The quality of touch depended on social roles. Men and women navigated shared spaces differently. Women, often smaller and more confined by domestic chores, found their movements constrained in crowded beds or shared rooms. Men, larger and stronger, adjusted less, but still experienced contact in predictable ways. Each person adapted to their circumstances, learning which motions caused disturbance and which passed unnoticed. A nightly negotiation built into every night's rhythm. Sleep depended on this adaptation. Without it, the night would be restless, body and mind alerted to every sensation. But the repeated exposure, the layering of textures, temperatures, and proximity allowed bodies to surrender gradually. Touch became ordinary, expected, and almost invisible. The house, the family, the animals, and the linens all participated in this subtle orchestra, guiding the sleeper toward rest. The transition from evening chores to sleep was never abrupt. Lamps dimmed and conversation faded. The residual touch of activity lingered on the skin. Fingers carried traces of dough or soap. Fabric clung faintly to sweat, and the warmth of another person's hand or shoulder persisted. Every brush, every press was a gentle reminder of the day's labor, extending its presence into the night. The body learned to tolerate these subtleties, allowing sensation to exist without interruption. A quiet surrender that defined Victorian rest. The arrangement of furniture influenced nightly contact. Beds were placed where space allowed, not necessarily for comfort. Tables, chairs, and chests crowded rooms, constraining movement. Limbs pressed against the edges of furniture in sleep. Toes touched cold floorboards, and elbows grazed neighboring bodies in tight quarters. The mind adjusted to these intrusions without conscious thought, interpreting touch as a normal element of the environment rather than a cause for alarm. Temperature played a constant role in sensation. Hearths offered intermittent warmth, but rooms rarely retained it uniformly. Cold corners pressed against skin, damp patches clung to bedding, and bodies sought refuge under shared blankets. In crowded rooms, the warmth of one body mitigated the chill of another, producing subtle but consistent contact. These thermal interactions were as important as direct touch in shaping the experience of night. Evenings were punctuated by rituals that amplified tactile awareness. The final wiping of hands, the folding of laundry, or the stacking of dishes left surfaces slightly damp or textured. When bodies later lay in bed, these residual impressions pressed against skin, providing a continuum of sensation that linked day to night. Touch was never isolated. It was accumulated, layered, and continuous, connecting the physical and temporal aspects of life. The presence of children altered adult perception of touch. Small hands sought comfort or warmth, brushing against arms and legs. Their restless movements disrupted patterns, requiring adults to shift subtly without awakening fully. Parents learned to anticipate these intrusions, adjusting position and pressure reflexively. Touch, in this sense, was both a challenge and a reassurance, a sign of life and continuity within the household. Animals reinforced the tactile rhythm, cats kneading blankets, dogs shifting under tables, and rodents skittering across floorboards created a dynamic network of contact. Each movement, however slight, transmitted sensation to human occupants. Sleepers learned to distinguish between predictable, familiar touches and unexpected ones, a skill honed over years of shared nights. The mind relaxed only when the pattern of contact became comprehensible, when touch could be integrated into rest rather than resisted. Bodies became attuned to these rhythms over time. Muscles adapted to the pressure of neighbors, blankets, and uneven mattresses. Nerves filtered minor intrusions, signaling only when adjustment was necessary. The cumulative effect of these experiences allowed sleep to arrive gradually, uninterrupted by the constant stimuli that otherwise defined the room. Touch was not eliminated. It was sublimated, absorbed into the broader pattern of nocturnal life. Even in solitary rooms, touch persisted. Cold walls pressed against shoulders, drafts slid across exposed limbs, and the weight of blankets created subtle pressure points. Without other bodies to share contact, The environment itself provided continuous sensation. Sleep became a negotiation with these forces, a careful balance between relaxation and the unavoidable awareness of physical presence. Every night reinforced this education of the body. Touch became a language understood without words, a form of communication with the environment, neighbors, and the house itself. Sensations were cataloged, anticipated, and integrated into sleep. By the time morning approached, the body had learned to navigate pressure, warmth, and movement with ease, transforming potential discomfort into the foundation of rest. In this way, the tactile dimension of Victorian nights shaped both body and mind. It was not merely incidental, it was essential. Every brush, every pressure, every temperature shift taught the sleeper endurance, patience, and attention to subtle signals. Sleep did not arrive in isolation. It was woven from the texture of life, the presence of others, and the constant, quiet rhythm of touch. Night inside Victorian homes carried a particular awareness of the body's boundaries, because those boundaries were constantly tested. Sleep was not a disappearance of sensation, but a rearranging of it. As people lay still, they felt the firm resistance of mattresses stuffed with straw or horsehair, uneven and slowly shifting under weight. The body learned the shape of these surfaces intimately, memorizing where pressure would gather and where relief could be found after long minutes of stillness. Clothing worn to bed added another layer of touch. Nightshirts, often unwashed for days, clung to skin with familiar stiffness. Seams pressed gently against shoulders and hips, reminding the sleeper of posture, even in rest. These garments were not designed for comfort in the modern sense. They were barriers, absorbing sweat, dirt, and oils, creating a muted but constant friction that the body gradually ignored through repetition. Blankets contributed their own language of contact. Woolen coverings were heavy and coarse, weighing down limbs and trapping warmth unevenly. Some areas overheated, while others remained exposed to cold air creeping through cracks in walls or windows. The contrast sharpened awareness, forcing small adjustments throughout the night. Each shift was careful and practiced, intended to preserve warmth without disturbing others sharing the bed or room. The architecture of houses intensified this experience. Walls were thin, floors unforgiving, and ceilings low. When someone turned in their sleep, the vibration traveled through the structure, translating movement into sensation for others. Even without direct contact, bodies felt one another through the house itself, as if the building were an extension of the nervous system, transmitting presence quietly and persistently. Sleep was further shaped by the fear of intrusion. Locks were simple, windows fragile, and sounds ambiguous in the dark. A brush against skin could be a blanket slipping, a child shifting, or something less familiar. Rather than panic, most people cultivated a controlled alertness, a half-awareness that allowed them to rest while remaining responsive. Touch became a signal to be interpreted, not immediately feared. In shared sleeping spaces, personal boundaries softened over time. Elbows touched ribs, knees pressed against the backs, and breath warmed necks. What might feel invasive today was normalized through necessity. The body adapted by recalibrating its sense of personal space, accepting proximity as a condition of survival. Sleep arrived not by escaping contact, but by incorporating it into comfort. Even the absence of touch carried meaning. When a familiar pressure was missing, a spouse's weight, a child's warmth, an animal's presence, the body noticed. Sleep felt lighter, interrupted by the awareness of space where something had once been. Touch, therefore, was not only physical, but emotional, anchoring people to routines and relationships, even in unconsciousness. Over years, this nightly education reshaped endurance. Bodies became tolerant of discomfort, minds skilled at drifting despite constant sensation. Touch lost its sharpness and gained familiarity, becoming part of the background rhythm of life. Victorian sleep was not defined by silence or emptiness, but by continuous, manageable contact that never fully ceased, even in the deepest hours of night. As the night progressed, touch often arrived through objects rather than people. The slow cooling of the room made wooden bed frames contract, producing faint shifts that traveled into the mattress. A sleeper might feel a slight change beneath the spine or shoulders, not enough to wake fully, but enough to register. These movements reminded the body that the house itself was active, responding quietly to temperature, weight, and time. Small animals were another constant presence. Mice moved within walls or beneath floorboards. Their activity translated into vibrations that reached the bed. Occasionally, a brush against skin came from a cat seeking warmth or a dog adjusting its position nearby. Such contact was rarely surprising. These animals shared living space closely, and their movements blended into the expected texture of night. Insects also played a role in shaping awareness. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were common companions. Their bites felt most clearly during stillness. The body learned to distinguish between imagined sensations and real ones, reacting only when irritation crossed a familiar threshold. Scratching was restrained, often postponed until morning, as movement at night risked cold, noise, or unwanted attention. The air itself carried touch through smell and moisture. Dampness clung to skin, especially in colder seasons, making sheets feel heavier as they absorbed humidity. Breathing became a tactile experience, cold air passing through the nose and settling in the chest. These sensations grounded sleepers in their physical surroundings, planning the complete detachment that modern sleep often allows. Dreams merged easily with physical feeling. A pressure on the arm might become part of a dream narrative, a weight explained by the sleeping mind rather than questioned. This blending softened the boundary between waking and sleeping, allowing rest to continue despite interruptions. Touch did not always pull people out of sleep. It often reshaped it from within. Morning revealed how fully the body had adapted. Stiffness, small bites, and faint impressions left by seams or bedding were accepted without comment. These marks were temporary records of the night, expected and unremarkable. The absence of complaint reflected not indifference, but familiarity, a quiet understanding of what sleep required in that world. Over time, this continuous exposure built resilience. Touch at night was neither comforting nor alarming, it was simply present. Victorian homes taught their occupants to rest amid constant sensation, to accept contact as part of existence. Sleep was not a retreat from the world, but a negotiation with it, conducted gently, night after night. Night inside Victorian homes was shaped by the awareness of other bodies nearby. Even when rooms were shared only by family, sleep rarely occurred in complete isolation. The sound of breathing, the shifting of weight, the occasional cough or sigh created a quiet network of presence. Touch did not always involve skin meeting skin. It often arrived through the shared mattress, the tremor of movement passing through straw or horsehair, reminding each sleeper that rest was collective rather than solitary. Children learned this closeness early, slept close to siblings or parents, limbs occasionally overlapping, blankets pulled and returned without ceremony, a foot pressing against another leg, or a small hand resting against fabric was accepted without reaction. These contacts were not interpreted as intrusion. They were signs of safety, of warmth, of belonging within the household, especially during long winters when darkness lingered. Adults carried a different awareness. For them, touch at night often carried responsibility rather than comfort. A mother, half awake, sensed a child's movement immediately, adjusting covers or posture without fully waking. A laborer felt the presence of others as a reminder to remain still, conserving warmth and rest for the coming day. Sleep required attention even in its most passive form. Shared rooms also meant shared boundaries. People learned where their body ended and another's began, navigating sleep carefully to avoid disturbance. This awareness shaped posture, breathing, and even dreams. The body trained itself to remain contained, minimizing movement Touch became predictable, limited, and therefore manageable, woven into routine rather than emotion. In this environment, privacy was not defined by distance, but by restraint. Respect was shown through stillness, through the quiet management of one's own body. Nightly touch reflected social order as much as physical necessity. Sleep became a practice of coexistence, where rest depended not on isolation, but on the careful acceptance of others nearby. Beyond the bed itself, the house continued to make contact with those trying to sleep. Walls were thin and close, often still warm from the day. In narrow rooms, a shoulder might brush plaster when turning, or fingers graze rough wood along the bed frame. These sensations were familiar enough to fade into the background, yet present enough to remind sleepers that the house enclosed them tightly, leaving little unused space. Animals added another layer of contact. Cats moved freely through rooms, settling near warmth, stepping lightly across blankets or chests. Mice brushed against walls or floors, their movement sometimes mistaken for something larger in the half-dreaming mind. In poorer homes, insects were unavoidable. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs created small, persistent sensations that blurred the line between waking and sleep. Scratching was instinctive, performed without thought. Fabric itself was a constant intermediary. Nightshirts, blankets, and sheets were coarse by modern standards. Wool scratched, linen stiffened, seams pressed against skin. These textures shaped how bodies rested, encouraging stillness simply to avoid irritation. Touch was rarely soft. It was practical, unavoidable, and endured rather than enjoyed. Comfort came from familiarity, not luxury. The mind adapted to this steady contact. Sensations that might have alarmed a modern sleeper were filtered out through repetition. A brush against the leg, a weight near the feet, a crawling tickle along the arm were registered and dismissed almost instantly. Fear did not vanish, but it dulled through exposure. The body learned what could be ignored. Over time, this constant physical awareness shaped how people understood rest itself. Sleep was not escape from sensation, but coexistence with it. Touch at night reminded sleepers of the limits of their space and the presence of others, human and otherwise. In Victorian homes, darkness did not separate bodies from the world. It pressed them closer to it, quietly, every night. As night settled fully, the house became more active in subtle ways. Wood contracted as temperatures dropped, beams shifting with quiet pressure. Floorboards tightened, then released, producing soft movements that traveled through the structure. These changes were felt as much as heard. A sleeper might sense a slight vibration through the bed frame or a gentle movement beneath the mattress, not strong enough to wake fully, but present enough to register in the body. Air moved differently after midnight. Drafts slipped through gaps around windows and doors, brushing exposed skin with cold fingers. Curtains stirred faintly. The feeling of air against the face or neck often prompted a half-conscious adjustment, pulling blankets higher or turning away without opening the eyes. These motions happened slowly, guided by sensation rather than thought. Shared rooms intensified this awareness. The warmth of another body altered the air nearby, creating pockets of heat and coolness. An arm shifting or a leg extending might press briefly against another sleeper, then withdraw. These contacts were rarely acknowledged. They were part of the night's background, absorbed into the rhythm of breathing and stillness. Outside, sounds carried inward with clarity. A cart passing on distant stone, a dog moving through an alley, the wind against shutters. Each vibration traveled through walls and floors, sometimes felt before it was understood. The body responded first, tightening slightly, then relaxing once the sound passed. This constant adjustment kept sleep light and responsive. In this environment, touch did not signal danger or comfort alone. It signaled the presence. The house, the air, the people within it all remained close, never fully separate. Sleep occurred within this web of contact, shaped by it, night until it felt ordinary and expected. Objects within the room also participated in this quiet contact. Bedding shifted as bodies settled deeper into sleep, fabric brushing skin repeatedly through the night. Wool blankets scratched lightly, sheets folded and unfolded with movement, and pillows pressed against faces and shoulders in unfamiliar ways as sleepers turned. These sensations accumulated slowly, forming a constant layer of physical awareness that never fully disappeared. Insects were an accepted presence. Fleas, lice, and other small creatures moved through bedding and clothing, especially in warmer months. Their touch was brief and often indistinct. A tickle, a pinprick, a crawling sensation that blended into half-dreaming thought. People learned to scratch without waking, hands moving automatically before returning to stillness. Walls themselves felt close. Beds were placed near them for warmth, and sleepers sometimes rested with an arm or back pressed against plaster or wood. As temperatures dropped, surfaces cooled, drawing heat from the body. The contrast between warm flesh and cold structure remained noticeable even through sleep, a reminder of the thin barrier between comfort and exposure. Fireplaces, though dark, still influenced the room. Residual warmth radiated unevenly, creating subtle shifts in temperature that moved across the body. A sleeper might wake briefly, feeling too warm on one side, too cold on the other, turning instinctively to rebalance. These adjustments happened repeatedly, quietly reshaping the night. By morning, these countless moments of touch were forgotten individually. Yet together, they defined what night felt like. Sleep was never empty or untouched. It was a continuous negotiation with the physical world, carried out without awareness, accepted as the natural condition of rest. Night in a Victorian home rarely ended cleanly. Sleep loosened its hold gradually, releasing the body in stages rather than all at once. Even before waking, touch continued. The mattress pressed unevenly against hips and shoulders, reminding the sleeper where weight had rested for hours. Muscles felt stiff, not from strain, but from long stillness. The body registered itself again through contact before thought fully returned. Morning cold was often the first clear sensation. Fires had burned low or gone out completely during the night. Air pooled near the floor, heavy and damp. Feet touched the ground cautiously, testing the temperature of bare boards. That brief contact, skin against cold wood, pulled the mind fully awake, anchoring it back in the physical world. Bedding carried the night with it. Sheets held warmth unevenly, cooler where the body had moved away, warmer where sleep had lingered longest. Blankets smelled faintly of wool, smoke, and the body itself. These sensations did not invite reflection. They were familiar enough to be ignored, yet present enough to be felt every morning. Clothing waiting nearby offered its own quiet resistance. Garments were stiff from wear and infrequent washing. Fabric rubbed against skin as layers were pulled on, reminding the body that the day would involve friction, pressure, and endurance. Dressing was not a gentle process. It was efficient, physical, and often rushed against the cold. Touch extended beyond the individual. Sleepers rose around one another, careful not to disturb more than necessary. A brushed arm, a shifted chair, a brief accidental contact at the wash basin. These moments passed without comment. Physical proximity required constant adjustment, and people learned to navigate it without apology. Water used for washing was cold unless deliberately heated. Faces and hands were rinsed quickly, the shock of cold, sharp, and unmistakable. This contact served a purpose beyond cleanliness. It marked the transition from night to day, from passive endurance to active movement. The body responded before the mind had time to complain. As daylight strengthened, the memory of night faded quickly. The sensations that had filled the dark hours, crawling, pressure, shifting warmth, lost their urgency. Work demanded attention. Routine reclaimed the body. Touch became functional again, tied to tools, surfaces, and labor rather than sleep. Yet the body remembered even when the mind did not. Night after night of shared rooms, imperfect bedding, and constant physical presence shaped expectations. Comfort was defined narrowly. Discomfort was tolerated without surprise. The boundary between rest and irritation remained thin but stable. Victorian sleep was not haunted by fear alone. It was shaped by contact, persistent, unavoidable, and ordinary. To touch the body at night was rarely mysterious. It was the house, the bedding, the insects, the air, and the presence of others, all working quietly together. By evening, the body would return to these same conditions without protest. Night would settle again, and touch would resume its steady, unnoticed work. Sleep did not erase sensation. It simply taught people how to live with it. As night returned, the house prepared itself in small, habitual ways. Doors were checked, fires banked, shutters drawn, not to block danger, but to manage cold and drafts. Each action involved touch, hands against iron latches, fingers brushing soot-darkened stone, palms resting briefly on worn wood. These motions were repeated so often they required no thought. The body knew what to do before the mind noticed it was doing anything at all. Beds were approached with familiarity rather than comfort. Mattresses accepted weight reluctantly, springs or straw shifting beneath the body. The first contact was always a small negotiation, hips settling, shoulders adjusting, knees finding space. Nothing fit perfectly, yet nothing felt unexpected. Sleep began, not with ease, but with acceptance. Its darkness returned quickly once candles were extinguished. Without light, the body relied entirely on touch to understand its position. A hand reached for the edge of the bed. A foot searched for solid ground before pulling up beneath a blanket. These movements were careful, practiced, and quiet, shaped by years of navigating the same space without sight. As sleep deepened, sensation did not disappear. It softened. The body remained aware of pressure points, of fabric against skin, of subtle changes in temperature. A sleeve twisted slightly around an arm. Blanket slipped lower, exposing a shoulder to cooler air. These changes registered without waking fully, prompting small adjustments that restored balance. In shared rooms, other bodies shifted as well. The sound of movement carried easily, but it rarely startled anyone awake. The presence of others was constant enough to feel neutral, almost grounding. Even unfamiliar sleepers became part of the background rhythm, their movements blending into the house itself. The house continued to touch its occupants through the night. Walls cooled, floors contracted, beams settled with soft, irregular sounds. Air moved slowly through unseen gaps, brushing faces and hands. These contacts reminded sleepers that the building was alive in its own way, responding to temperature and time. Occasionally, a sleeper woke fully for a moment. Sudden itch, a sharp chill, the sense of something moving nearby. In darkness, imagination filled the space briefly, then receded. Most disturbances were resolved by touch. A scratch, a blanket pulled higher, a hand pressed against the mattress to reassure the body of its place. Sleep returned without ceremony. There was no effort to analyze sensation, no attempt to assign meaning. Touch at night was not interpreted as comfort or threat. It was simply part of being indoors, part of being alive in a world where isolation was rare. By the final hours before dawn, the body grew still again. Sensation dulled. Awareness narrowed. What had touched the sleeper throughout the night faded into a general memory of weight and warmth. Individual moments were lost, absorbed into the larger experience of rest. This was how nights passed in Victorian homes, not in silence, not in emptiness, but in constant, quiet contact. Nothing dramatic was required. The ordinary world pressed gently but persistently against the body, until morning arrived once more. Night reached its steepest point when the house no longer shifted as often. The structure had settled into the cold, and the people inside had settled into their own stillness. At this hour, touch became less noticeable, not because it stopped, but because the body had grown accustomed to it. Sensation blurred into a general awareness of weight, warmth, and pressure, all held together by familiarity rather than comfort. Breathing slowed across the rooms. Chests rose and fell in uneven rhythms, some shallow, some heavy. The air felt thicker, carrying the combined warmth of bodies and the faint residue of smoke and fabric. Sleepers lay surrounded by this atmosphere, their skin quietly responding to changes they would never consciously remember. Objects that had felt intrusive earlier now disappeared into the background. The scratch of wool, the firmness of wood beneath thin padding, the coolness of plaster nearby, all merged into a single, stable environment. Touch no longer asked for adjustment. It asked only for endurance, and the body complied without resistance. Even fear softened at this hour. The imagination, tired from its earlier vigilance, loosened its grip. Sounds still occurred, but they no longer demanded explanation. A creak, a sigh, a distant movement passed through the sleeping mind without forming a story. Touch remained, but meaning drained away from it. This was the closest Victorian nights came to peace. Not silence, not absence, but familiarity, worn smooth by repetition. The house continued to press gently against those inside it, and they remained within it, resting not because the night was kind, but because the body had learned there was no alternative. As the first light began to form outside, the house sensed it before the people did. A cold shifted slightly. Air moved differently through cracks and seams. Walls released a small amount of tension as temperature changed. These were subtle signals, but the body noticed them even in sleep, responding with shallow movements, a turn of the head, a tightening of limbs beneath blankets. Touch changed again in these final hours. What had felt neutral became noticeable once more. Fabric pressed differently as sleepers stirred. Mattresses no longer held weight evenly. A hand rested against wood or iron and felt the chill that had built overnight. These sensations marked the slow return to awareness, though eyes remained closed. Those who woke early did so quietly. There was no sharp division between sleep and waking. Consciousness arrived gradually, carried by touch rather than thought. A foot slid toward the floor. Fingers searched for balance. The body tested the room before committing to movement, relearning its shape through contact. In shared spaces, this transition happened collectively. One person shifting caused another to stir. Breath patterns changed. Small sounds returned. Fabric moving, a low cough, the careful repositioning of weight. The night loosened its hold without fully releasing anyone yet. What had touched people during the night left no record. There were no words for it, no reflection. It existed only as a bodily memory, soon overwritten by routine. Once fully awake, attention turned outward again, to work, to obligation, to the visible world. The house remained behind, holding the impressions of the night without comment. It had done what it always did, contained bodies, pressed against them, shaped their rest. When night returned again, it would repeat the same quiet work, unnoticed and unremembered. Dest was the ordinary truth of Victorian nights. Nothing supernatural was required. Nothing dramatic needed to appear. Touch alone, constant and unavoidable, was enough to fill the darkness until morning arrived.